to leave that space. But I promise you it will certainly be worth it, because panel number 3, like the first 2 this morning, is just an amazing group of Meridian scholars. And it did occur to me that I should mention, I've said this to a couple of the folks, that the composition of the panels, as you might imagine, selecting 16 people out of the 700 plus that have been published in Meridians over the past 25 years is no small feat, right? But one of the things that was guiding the decision-making for me was to try and represent the editorial work of each of the 4 editors. So Kumkum Bhavnani, Miriam Shansi, Paula Giddings, and me, right, over the past 25 years, as well as the editorial collective. So that was one of the things, and it wasn't just like chronological, right, making sure that everybody from 2000 and 2001 to 2025, literally the fall issue, was represented. It was really trying to exemplify that even though each issue has been edited by essentially 5, and actually if you think about the collective, it's that's 8 people, different folks, there's a through thread, right? You can see the kind of consistency across each of these papers and their authors and contributors. So with that said, let me begin by introducing our moderator, Professor Carol Bailey. Carol Bailey is a professor of Black Studies at Amherst College. She teaches courses in African American, African diasporic, and Caribbean literatures, as well as in interdisciplinary Black Studies. She is the author of Writing the Black Diasporic City in the Age of Globalization, published by Rutgers University Press. A Poetics of Performance, the Oral Scribal Aesthetic in Anglophone Caribbean Fiction, published by the University of West Indies Press, and co-editor with Stephanie McKenzie of Pamela Mordecai's A Fierce Green Place, published by New Directions. She is also herself a Meridians author. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bailey. Presenting on the panel is also Professor Denise Schallenkammer. Born in 1993, makes me feel very old, I have to say, studied English, British, and American transcultural studies, as well as communication and media studies in Germany, Ireland, and New Zealand, and holds a Master of Arts in the latter 2 subjects. She is a PhD student currently at the Institute for Media Research at the University of Rostock and is about to submit her doctoral dissertation. She is also a former research associate at the Sorbian Institute in Bautzen, Germany. Her dissertation project deals with the comparison of filmic depictions of Zorbs, one of the 4 officially recognized ethnic minorities in Germany, and the Maori, the indigenous people of New Zealand. Please welcome, about to be Dr. Schallenkammer. Professor Chandra Frank is an assistant professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies at the University of Cincinnati and an independent curator. She is the 2024-2027 Taft Professor of the Public Humanities. Her interdisciplinary research focuses on feminist and queer of color movement work, possibilities of dissent, the politics of water, and the ways in which race and the environment work as terrains of power. She is a founding member of the Tidal Studies Group, a collaborative collective exploring the rhythms, currents, spillage, and intimacies of water. Please welcome Chandra Frank. Dr. Selina Makana is an assistant professor of African history at the University of Memphis. Her research and teaching focus on African history, gender and militarism, and African diasporic studies. Informs her current monograph, Beyond the Battlefield, Women and the Nation in 20th Century Angola, forthcoming from Ohio University Press. This book probes the relationship between women, war, and the nationalist politics of Angola. In her articles, her articles have been published in Meridians, Feminism, Race, Transnationalism, two, by the way, published in Meridians, 2 articles. Gender in History, Genda, a Journal of Culture and African Women's Studies, and the Oxford Encyclopedia of African Women's History. Please welcome Professor Makana. And last but most certainly not least, Dr. Janell Hobson. Janell Hobson is a professor in the Department of Women's, Genders, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Albany. She is also director of the department's undergraduate studies and honors program, a Collins Fellow, and the 2025-2026 Faculty Grand Marshal. She is the author of When God Lost Her Tongue, Routledge 2021, Venus in the Dark, Routledge 2005, with a second publication in 2018, and Body as Evidence, SUNY Press 2012. She is also a 2-time guest editor of Meridians, as well as a Meridians author. Please welcome Dr. Hobson. And with that, I'll turn it right over to the panelists.
Thank you so much. Are you hearing me, everybody? Yes. Thank you so much, Janetta, and congratulations to, of course, somebody has to drive this. It's a collective, but somebody has to drive the vehicle, and we're thrilled, Janetta, that you are the driver. Thank you so much for all that you do, for your energy, for your organization. And if I ever manage to grow, I'll have half your everything. So thank you so much. One quick thing I wanted to add by way of congratulations and also advertisement, that one of our panelists here, Chandra, has a forthcoming book. It's co-edited alongside Nancy Jorwi.
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
and Mickey Stelter. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
and the title is The Gloria Wecker Reader. It's forthcoming from Duke, April of 2026. So take note, and be on the lookout. And congratulations. So just a quick word on the way we have conceived of the panel working. I will be asking each author, each panelist, specific questions about particular works. And each one will have 10-ish minutes to respond to the questions. But before that, and then of course we'll have your audience questions. But before that, I have one kind of set of open questions in honor of Meridians that I know, well, I believe that I actually know, I don't know a lot of things, but this I know, that each author would love to say about Meridians and about the significance of this moment. So here are the questions. I'm acting like I'm young reading from my phone. My first, I'm going to read all 3 of them, and I've asked the panelists to address them in whatever, thank you, in whatever order they want, or they can take one of the questions or all of them. So one of them is, what has publishing in Meridian meant to you? Just in general. The next question is, what for you has been the significance of this journal in your field? For your professional development. And for this second question, I'm asking the panelists to think through not just for themselves as individual professionals, but also what having this journal in their particular fields has meant. And then the last one is, what for each of you is the significance of this moment, this 25th anniversary moment of marking this important milestone in Meridians? And I'll hand it over to you. We've asked the authors, the presenters, to speak in the order in which they're listed here. So Denise first, Chandra, Selina, and then Janell. So starting with Denise.
So, yeah, Thanks for the invitation, and I'm really glad I could make it over to the US to participate in the panel and get to know so many beautiful and wonderful women. That's really a really great experience for me. And what does publishing in Meridians mean to me? So like many others before, I have to share that publishing in Meridians was my first article ever peer-reviewed, published there. So thank you very much for that. I'm really honored that you decided to publish my article. And I'm even more honored to get invited to such a great event. And that's the first time for me being part of such an event. And that's, it's really like an adventure to me. So because I'm in the beginning of my academic career, I would say. So hopefully in the spring next year, I will submit my doctoral thesis. This would be very great. I'm really looking forward to what all the other panelists have to say according to our theme about representations. And yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Chandra?
Thank you. And thank you for these questions, these opening questions, and for this gathering. I think gathering and centers is kind of where I'm finding this question. I've been really mindful of what it means to center feminism and queerness in a time like this. And I think I shared with a couple of people over lunch already that at the University of Cincinnati, we have experienced the shutdown of our centers. So women's studies, LGBTQ studies, ethnic services program studies. We've also lost faculty associations, right? So it feels like a really dire political time, but also a time where centers feel really crucial. And so I'm really grateful to be here, to be kind of thinking in a center of transnational feminists here. But I also feel like it gives some hope to our community and students who have lost their centers and their places of belonging, to point them to other places where centers are and are growing. And then also the work that I got to publish in Meridians was about a center, and it's Flamboyant, which is a center which operated in the 1980s, and it was Black and migrant-led. And the work that the center did, I see it very much so being akin to the mission of Meridians. And they were an archive, amongst others, and I'll speak about this a bit later. But part of what happened, obviously, burnout, lack of funding, really hard to sustain an archive in the Netherlands in the 1980s in a very white colonial landscape. So that archive kind of shut down, and their materials became part of a white archive in Amsterdam, white feminist archive. And so spending time reading those materials in that archive and then being able to publish their work and materials from their newsletter in Meridians, I feel like it's been an incredible homage to their work and their transnational work. And without the and between thinking about race and feminism and transnationalism, because that was exactly the intervention that they made. So I appreciate the idea of circles and centers and the ways in which this has really brought together so many different things for me.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Selina?
Yeah, I'll join the choir and just say again, thank you all for being here. Thank you to Janell and the whole Meridian teams for making this particular moment, possible for all of us. And for me in particular, that first question, like, what does it really mean publishing in Meridians? On a personal level, it's more of like, I got a job because of this. So I was able to feed myself because of my first article, which I've been talking about. So that is real. So Meridian saves lives. And but just also beyond myself as an African woman, just having a journal that also just sort of reflects my own transnational roots. I'm Kenyan, I work on Angola, East, South, Southern Africa, then I found myself in the United States. And so like, how do you find a voice within that specific space? And as an African woman, I think it's very critical to center, for me at least, foreground, amplify and center voices of African women in spaces where they either ignored or somehow marginalized, or just somehow it's like, meh, so what, right? So Meridian is that space for me, at least with this particular, the first 2 articles that I published with them. So I'm really grateful for that moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Yes, yes.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Janetta, for the invitation to be part of this. This has been such a rewarding experience so far, from last night's keynote panel to earlier this lunch and the performance and the message of radical joy is a radical act. I'm going to walk away with that. But to answer the questions for this panel on representation, I think often of impact and legacy with regards to what Meridians means to me. And specifically, this Meridians gave me an opportunity because I realized that in addition to being an author, a scholar, a professor, teacher, I've also been an editor. And I've edited a few edited volumes, one with SUNY Press, one with Routledge. I have another one actually coming out called Shelter, Home and Community Building as Black Feminist Praxis. Got some great people who are going to be putting that together. That's going to be coming out in a few years. I'm still putting that together. But Meridians was, and I also did some editing for Ms. Magazine because I am a regular writer for them and did a special project back in 2022 to mark Harriet Tubman's bicentennial birthday. But before I did that, I did a centennial of her passing back in 2013 with Meridians. So Meridians gave me that opportunity to actually be a guest editor. The first time was back in 2008 when I actually co-edited with the late R. Diane Bartlow. Unfortunately, she's passed. She passed away in 2022. But we did this special issue on women, hip hop, and popular music. We've had some really great articles that came out of that issue. When we talk about impact, widely cited. I'm thinking of Daphne Brooks, Murray Miller Young, Whitney Peoples. All of those folks were in that particular issue, and I claim every one of them. Like, yeah, I publish you guys first. And then also with the Harriet Tubman was the special issue, which actually emerged out of a symposium. It's kind of like this, but this was marking the centennial back in 2013 of Harriet Tubman. And for both issues, I worked with Paula Giddings and was able to reach out to her because of my connection with my former professor, Beverly Guy-Sheftall. And, it was great that she gave me an opportunity and the chance to actually do this work. So there's also what I'm reminded of just in terms of today's symposium, the work that I did with Paula Giddens, this idea that Meridians was always this inclusive space. And I knew it was already inclusive because I figured they were the journal that I could actually approach with regards to the ideas that I wanted to explore, whether it was hip hop or Harriet Tubman, and oftentimes both. And by that, I mean, like, I remember 1990 when Queen Latifah came out with her Ladies First, the very first image is Harriet Tubman, and already linking Black feminism and transnational feminism through that lens and learning about Black feminist thought before I even read bell hooks. So I think about the impact of popular culture as well as art and representation. So impact, 2 months ago, I'm in Charleston, where I was invited to be part of an important panel at the Gibbs Museum of Art, which featured an exhibit about Harriet Tubman. And I was invited specifically because they read my Meridians article, Between Fantasy and Reality. Absolutely. And that was in and of itself an interesting experience because I'm there before an audience that is as diverse as queer folk and radical folk and students from the Citadel who were there because Harriet Tubman is their hero. and talk about a figure who can unite across these very different ideological backgrounds. It happened also back in 2013 when I organized a symposium. I had folks from the Black church alongside LGBTQ folks sitting alongside each other because they all claim Harriet Tubman. And I oftentimes think about what is that impact? What is that representation? What does that mean? So, but yes, I feel that with Meridians, I'm able to shape this kind of academic conversation, but to also move beyond the academy in these ways. And Meridians also provides that space. So even before I'm able to write about, in a more popular media like Ms., for example. And I actually reprinted the essay, The Rape of Harriet Tubman. I saw it was listed in the program. That was something I wrote first in Ms., but we had a space to be able to feature that in Meridians. And, talk about full circle moment, that an affective experience. I wrote that out of rage based on this ridiculous video that came out called the Harriet Tubman sex tape, put out under Def Jam Digital, that was being launched by back then Russell Simmons, who is now in exile, trying to escape various rape charges right now. And I actually had an opportunity to interview as well as appear with one of his survivors, Drew Dixon, 2 years ago when we were celebrating the 50th anniversary of hip hop. So full circle moment, it's like, yeah, I wrote this piece thinking about him, and here I am working alongside people who've survived him and who are still doing that work. So that is really what I think of Meridians as, being able to have real impact and a real legacy.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. So obviously, I'm not a panelist here, but I would be remiss if I didn't say my one bit about my own Meridian story. I too was first published in Meridians. My first publication in Meridians was actually in two separate volumes under Miriam Shansey, two book reviews. One was a book of poetry, and one was reviewing a book of poetry, Caribbean women's poetry, and the other one. And these reviews were consequential, especially the review of the novel. Not consequential by any means because of what I did, but because the novel was by an Indo-Caribbean woman. And Indo-Caribbean women writers were almost non-existent. Lakshmi Prasad is one of the first really well-known Indo-Caribbean women writers. So that's the kind of work Meridians did. And I did, and then I published an essay in a collection of essays. But my first peer review essay was published in Meridians with Paula. And then the one more thing I wanted to say about that is that not only was that essay published, but Paula actually taught me some very important things about how to write for a journal and for peer review. And she did not just write it to me. She actually had a phone call with me to say, here's the thing you need to do to just make the contribution. And for some reason, I think it's probably my most cited article. So I'm truly, truly grateful. And so when I saw that after Paula's departure, it was Janetta who was taking over. I obviously rejoiced. I had a few teaching stints here and had the pleasure of working with Janetta. And I have taught in multiple places, and I'm always organizing a symposium, and I'm always inviting Janetta, and she always comes. If it's Westfield, she's there. If it's Amherst College, wherever, she's always such a supportive colleague and such an energy. And I want to say this, not to butter you up, Janetta. I may beg you something later, who knows? But I really do want to say that this is a kind of thing that really speaks to the work that we do, because it's easy for us to write and talk and get all lyrical about what we do, but do we actually do? How do we relate to each other as feminist scholars? And I think that's a conversation that we need to have more, but to see that enacted is just really priceless. So thank you, Janetta, for your work with Meridians, but also for your example as a colleague and as a scholar. And my last testing, I promise, is that I am struck by how many people, how many of my colleagues here said that their first publication was with Meridians. Because here was I thinking I was the only one. And the reason I wanted to mention that one of our panelists last night mentioned being an elite publication without being elitist. And again, Janetta organized a wonderful workshop with African feminist scholars over the summer. And one of the things that we talked about in that workshop is how do we peer review in a way that's helpful, rigorous, but supportive? And that's something that I was happy to hear those wise women say we need to have more of in our profession. So, so thank you for being at the helm, Janetta, and thank you students and interns and staff and everybody. You're an amazing team, and it's my absolute delight to work with you. All right, now back to business. So I'm going to continue working with the panelists as they've listed, and as I said, we have specific questions for them. So I'm going to start with you, Denise. We get to haze you as the young person. But that, no, we're all friendly here. So you note in your 2023 article that, quote, film is an important part of identity formation and shapes the perceptions of indigenous cultures and peoples, unquote. You also discuss in detail Merata Mita, I hope I got that right, multiple roles as activist, filmmaker, woman, and mother. So I have two questions for you. One, why do you regard film as such a crucial mode of storytelling for the representation of experiences and cultures of indigenous people? What does it offer that other modes might not offer in quite the same way? And then like the second question related to this is, how much and how well do you think filmmaking advanced the other important subjectivities or roles that Mita embodied? So it's a mouthful, but she has the questions.
So yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for the questions. And I think I need to start to tell you how I came up with the idea of choosing this kind of topic. So just real quick, I've been to New Zealand to study a semester abroad, and shortly after that, I went to the Berlinale, the huge film festival in Germany, and in 2019. And at this time, they had a special section called Native, which they canceled a year after because they said due to budget, but I'm not sure about that. Yeah, and there I was watching Mita, which is who is Merata Mita's youngest son, his documentary, which is called Merata: How Mom Decolonized the Screen, and he released it in 2018. And it is an intimate portrayal of his mother, who is one of New Zealand's first Indigenous female filmmakers. And she was the first, and I think up to now, the remaining only female Indigenous filmmaker making a fiction feature film. And I was really impressed of this documentary. And when I saw the CFP for the special issue, and I was thinking about, okay, this was the first thing I came up with. Okay, about whom should I write? So what would be a good topic? And so it was like, okay, there's only one woman that really needs to be dealt with concerning this issue, and that's Merata Mita. So I decided that this article should illustrate the importance of Indigenous filmmaking by providing insights into the work and life of Merata Mita. So it's about making film and taking up space. So we bravely heard about taking up space after the performance when all of them were talking about that, for taking up space to live culture and to live identity and indigeneity. So this documentary and its relation and relevance for current issues gave rise to a closer look at Merata Mita and her stated mission, quote, to decolonize the screen and to indigenize a lot of what we see up there, end quote. So on the one hand, Mita was concerned with making the Indigenous people of New Zealand and their way of life visible through film and correcting distorted portrayals of Maori. And on the other hand, she advocated for self-determination and equal rights for women, especially of Indigenous origin. And so coming to your questions, yeah, to your question. So the histories of narratives of Indigenous peoples are usually marked by a lack of power, and their portrayals were or still are a stereotyped one, constructed by Western cultures and ideologies, and always different to products of Western civilization. So as a counter-reaction to years of discrimination, oppression, and marginalization, protest groups were formed and protest actions took place from the beginning of the middle of the 20th century onwards. But also art, literature, and film became an important tool for expressing resistance by drawing attention to political insensitivities and social injustices, as well as to re-establish Indigenous cultures, languages, identities, traditions, and values. So film has the power to raise public awareness and shape the perception of Indigenous peoples and cultures. And moving images in general fascinate and appeal to audiences both cognitively and emotionally. So film is able to address and represent, discuss, and change current situations and issues. And it also can cross national and international boundaries by speaking to wider experiences and universal struggles that are still being faced by Indigenous people everywhere across the world. Moreover, it has the power to revitalize and preserve cultural traditions, values, and identities. So, film played and still plays a special role in the act of self-empowerment and identity formation and self-determination. And it not only has the power to revise stereotypical images of Indigenous peoples and increase the public awareness about Indigenous issues with the help of realistic portrayals made from within Indigenous cultures. It also has the power to demystify those areas of knowledge so that as a consequence, knowledge expands and becomes common property. Further, the power of the image has the ability to reach people who do not have other communicative skills and offers a way to express themselves. And as Indigenous cultures are usually rooted in oral traditions, so they're not coming from a literary heritage, so their whole story is told in pictures. And these cultural, historical, and ancestral links to storytelling through picture naturally gravitate towards film. So as a filmmaker, someone is actually in the position of those who carried the oral tradition in olden days. And according to Mita, the combination of a film's technical complexity with traditional Indigenous philosophy allows an unfragmented view of society. So it can be said that filmmaking is a continuation of the oral tradition and thus a way to keep history and culture alive. And to stress the significance of the medium film, I want to talk real quick about Barry Barclay's idea of fourth cinema. So Barry Barclay is a Maori filmmaker, and he is credited as being the first Indigenous filmmaker making a fiction feature film. It's called Ngati and released in 1987. And he said that films made by members of Indigenous communities do not fit into the already existing framework of first, second, and third cinema. That's why he introduced a new category, which is called fourth cinema. And yeah, in order to legitimize and institutionalize Indigenous filmmaking. So in his category of fourth cinema refers to the fourth world model, which comprises Indigenous populations in parts of the world where they are excluded from power, and describes the process of decolonization based on the revitalization of Indigenous practices that colonization sought to destroy. So Barclay's fourth world aesthetic is based on the idea that being Indigenous is a shared experience and unites cultures through a shared sense of exclusion. But fourth cinema does not just comprise films made by Indigenous filmmakers, but refers to a distinct, politically engaged mode of filmmaking that has emerged from shared Indigenous experiences of exclusion in post-colonial settler states. And it allows for film practices and images that are controlled by and do justice to Indigenous peoples and their concerns and customs. So those films that fall under this category are narratively and aesthetically structured to offer alternatives to the three former models. Right. So I would say that's for the first part of the question. And just real quick, 2 minutes left. Yeah, I can do that. But I need to about the second question, the roles of Merata and Mita. I think on the one hand, filmmaking for her is a way to express and process her experiences as an activist, Indigenous woman, and mother. And on the other hand, filmmaking is a consequence of these experiences as an activist, Indigenous woman, and mother. And she began filming when she was working as a teacher at school, and she observed that many students, especially Maori, who do not have other communicative skills, were condemned to failure. And that's when she started to integrate using videos and films into her teaching. And that's when she recognized how powerful this medium is, powerful for her people, for telling their stories, for taking up space, for giving them a voice. She used it as a vehicle, as a weapon to reflect on these experiences and to take actions and to make them more accessible to others. So I think all the roles she embodies interact with each other, conditioning and nourishing each other.
Yeah. Thank you so very much. Thank you. Thanks a lot. So, Chandra, over to you. So I'm going to read a quote from one of your essays. So I found your insightful point both resonant and convicting, and I read the quote. It says, too often, European Black and women of color, feminist and queer movements, are illegible or solely read in dialectical opposition to second-wave feminism. European Black and women of color feminists are frequently understood through a US dominant lens, which erases the specificity of colonial and migratory histories, unquote. So please talk a bit for us about some specific ways that you have seen or believe attention to the work of European Black women and women of color, feminist and queer movement might enrich this area of study. That's feminist studies more broadly. And my second question is another quote. You note that, quote, affective diasporic kinship offered you a home, unquote. And I found this both the affective and the diasporic kinship component of what you said, especially remarkable because of their obvious significance, one, but also because despite their importance, these are not areas we attend to sufficiently in academia and in some of our activist-oriented fields, such as Black gender and diasporic studies. So I'm curious to hear more about what you think we gain when we attend to the affective, which we talked about this morning, and also to diasporic kinship and relationships more generally.
Thank you so much. I love people who are in the business of asking questions, and your questions are so layered and rigorous, and I really appreciate that. So I am going to try to be mindful of time and kind of combine these two. So I spoke a little bit earlier about the Flamboyant Collective, which was named after the flamboyant tree. And part of why this collective named themselves after this tree was because they felt that the flamboyant tree couldn't be tamed in the Dutch landscape. So these other plants, the ficus, the hibiscus, they were all tamed. Nothing against these plants. I support them. But according to the mission statement of the collective, the flamboyant tree kind of remained tall and wavering. And in their mission statement, they wrote that, you know, as in kin with this image, they would rather die than shrink or be tamed in the Dutch living room. And I found this really powerful, and I wanted to use the opportunity of this publication to flesh that out, to think about the refusal to not be tamed and the willingness to kind of, you know, die than to be part of this multicultural, progressive, sexual freedom, white representation that is the Dutch context, right? And so I became interested in thinking about this politic of refusal, but also in this time in the 1980s, what was really interesting for me was to kind of think about the politics of solidarity and being forced to flesh it out. So at this time, we see that in the context of this movement that I study, the Black migrant and refugee feminist movement, post-colonial migrants are coming together, right, from places like Suriname, Indonesia, the Dutch Caribbean, South Africa. Labor migrants are in the Netherlands from Turkey, Morocco, countries surrounding the Mediterranean Sea. And then there's an influx of women coming from different places as refugees, so Somalia, Iran, Afghanistan. Now, all these women are subjected to Dutch policy mechanisms, whether we speak about welfare, housing, etc. But of course, also the Dutch believe very firmly that the one thing that they would invest in is keeping migrants separate, right? They wanted folks to learn how to ride bikes and stay within their ethnic pillars. So the system of pillarization within the Dutch context is really strong. So I was really interested in thinking about what does the politics of solidarity mean when you have to get into these frictions and tensions, right? When you have to work not just across difference, when you have to honor difference, when you have to get to know about somebody else. So I was inspired by feminist consciousness raising in the 80s, literally being, what do Moroccan women experience? What is going on in your movement? Or even from women in the context of Suriname, like Afro-Surinamese women coming together with Hindustani women and having to sit with legacies of anti-Blackness, colorism, having to sit with that and work it out. And while I wasn't interested in thinking necessarily about the perfect solutions that do not exist, I was interested in highlighting that kind of these quotidian registers of working it out, of friendship, of an assemblage of women coming together, being faced by the way in which the Dutch government understood migrants to be malleable. And this is also where I've become interested in thinking about the landscape and the kind of the racial landscape. So I'm from Amsterdam, I grew up in Amsterdam. And of course, like our representations of anything queerness is pride, right? Pride is like one of the biggest kind of white export products of the Netherlands through which we are modeled queerness. And of course, the rest of us, migrants, are either straight or we magically have become queer upon arriving in the West, right? So I was curious about then how to translate this racial landscape through a queer diasporic framework, which is in dialogue with scholarship coming out of the US, right? And both the movement that I engaged with as well as myself, I would not be able to do this work without Black feminist scholarship coming from the US, right? Or queer diasporic scholarship coming from the US. And at the same time, I also realized that I was coming up against these politics of translation and the specificity of histories of race and empire that inform the way that within the context of Europe or the context of the Netherlands, we have to think differently about what it means for migrants to be situated in this place, right? But if we use the frameworks that are US dominant, or when we are forced to explain our work alongside these lines, I think there's something that happens that kind of erases this specificity. And so through the Flamboyant collective, who believed in honoring difference and who were writing about Palestine, right? They were writing about politics in South America. They were educating each other. And I should also thank Meridians that I've now been kind of found as a flamboyant scholar, because some colleagues in the UK are organizing this conference on flamboyancy. And they reached out because they found my article. So, I mean, no need to clap, but this is like a queer accomplishment for me, but they're yet to find funding for it. So, yeah, I've been interested in these politics of translation, the frameworks through which to understand the experiences of Black women and migrants in the Dutch context, and also to honor these very different histories of migration, right? So histories of post-colonial migration, histories of labor migration, and then to kind of find these feminist formations. And I feel like that work is really urgent, because what often happens, and I thank you for doing a plug about the Gloria Wekker Reader, many of us still have to come to the US to read each other or to be read, right? So Gloria Wekker, for sure, has been assigned across disciplines more often in the US than in the Netherlands, right? Than in Dutch academia. So this is also, I think, for us, really crucial to think about what it means to publish this kind of work and then to be forced to explain it through a US dominant lens, and or to kind of push back against the idea that within the context of Europe, queerness, diasporic queerness can only be understood through this like Euro queer framework, even though all these different lesbians had different ways of understanding and practicing queerness, right? Even the politics of naming. I love this conversation that happened in the 1980s between Audre Lorde and Astrid Roemer, who's a Surinamese writer. And they're talking about the politics of naming and whether it's important to call oneself a lesbian. And this conversation, I think, was great, because often what the narrative becomes, and I love these narratives as well, is that visits by Black feminists such as Audre Lorde have shaped feminism and migrant communities as if they weren't in knowledge production already themselves, right? They were fierce knowledge producers, and they were honored to be in conversation with Black feminists like Audre Lorde. But at the same time, these are often not the narratives that circulate. So I love these exchanges. I also love Audre Lorde reflecting on the books that she read at Gloria Wekker's house, right? And how that shaped her understanding of Suriname. And this is like to end this point around, friendship and erotics and the work that gets into thinking what it means to stay afloat together, to kind of stay afloat in this Dutch, which I think is quite literally a sinking landscape. And the urgency of that, because I feel that we need to think about solidarity as this very critical, ongoing practice, especially because there's often this understanding of the until, I will tide you over until, we will stay afloat until. And within the context of racial capitalism and these ongoing kind of attacks, I have found a lot of inspiration in this work and these models of organizing in the 1980s, because I think they give us a more durational way of being in conversation with each other, but also doing that collaborative work. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Chandra. Thanks a lot for that. Over to you, Selina. So Selina, your intervention through your theorization of patriotic motherhood feels very similar to Chandra's work on Flamboyant, in the sense that both call us, thank you, both call us to notice subjects and discourses that have not been sufficiently engaged in feminist and other related area studies. And so I found your statement, quote, "It is worthwhile to also emphasize that women experience patriarchal domination differently, an especially bold and useful one," because you're speaking to something that we kind of know in feminist discourse, but we don't say it enough, I think. So please reflect on your journey as a feminist scholar. How did you get here? to the point where you were able to make such an important intervention, especially one that centers on the work of women from an African country? And my second question is, where do you see the field now? And by this, I mean, to what extent do you think feminists and more broadly gender studies have opened?
Thank you again for your generous reading of my work. I'm going to respond to your insightful questions through stories. I come from a tradition of storytelling. I love stories. I love oral tradition. So I always find myself oral history, oral tradition as being one of the most profound methods that any scholar can be endowed with, especially if you're a scholar of histories that are most often marginalized, histories where, if you're from the continent, thinking about, again, the politics of knowledge production and the geographies of it all, where, again, it's certain colonial and post-colonial histories get to be amplified at the expense of others, right? And so those histories that have been marginalized, it's hard to find them in the written text. So you get to go to the, to the weeds, to the people's mouths, to find them where they are. And so to answer your question through the story, so I have 3 case scenarios here. But before I get into this, let me put on my professor hat here and turn us all into students of world history, okay, since 1500, okay? So imagine that's you're enrolled in this particular class. So my question to you would be, think about some of the greatest or biggest wars of the 20th century. What will be your first 5 or first 10? Just what countries come to mind when you think about the global wars of the 20th century? 1, raise your hand and just shout the answer. Congo. Mm-hmm.
Congo.
Vietnam, Congo again. Congo. Any other?
Germany.
Germany. It's world history, people. It's just, you don't have to be think, look, Korea. Okay, now let's narrow down. The continent of Africa. Okay, this is again an African history course now. On the continent.
Yeah.
The Biafra War in Nigeria, Angola, Uganda, Rwanda. Kenya too. All right, my work here is done. So
Liberia.
All right. Liberia as well. Yeah. So yeah, so at least you have an idea of what I'm getting at. So to me, at least, okay, it's hard to do what I do. It's hard for us to do, especially as feminist scholars, to do what we do if we do not begin from who we are. Mm-hmm. I'm a big believer in knowledge as being situated. I'm a big believer in the so-called positionality. So who I am, where I am from, informs my scholarship, informs the kind of claims I make, like the bold claim that you just mentioned. And so I got to this particular project, this particular essay, which is part of my dissertation. It's a chapter of my dissertation, and it's part of my book that's coming out in February. Shameless plug. So watch out for that. And I was frustrated being an African woman, having gone through undergrad, even just high school and undergrad in Kenya, talking about African politics and not being taught enough about the Portuguese world, the Portuguese African world, right? We learned about the Francophone Africa, we learned about even the freaking Italian invasion in Ethiopia, we learned about that. But my teachers, at least my professor, barely mentioned Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, right? Mm-hmm. And when Angola or Mozambique came into question, it was again through the lens of what I call in my book, the heroic masculinist figures of liberation struggles or of nationalist politics. So it was Neto, Savimbi, Mondlane, all these big people. And so where are the women? And so I was really frustrated, but within obviously the continent, you're talking about liberation movements, you're talking about nationalist politics, at least in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s, there's a lot of scholarship there, and those of us who are historians of African history know this. And so there's a lot of women liberation movements in Kenya or in British East Africa, women liberation movements in Nigeria, in Ghana, in South Africa. We talk about the ANC, the AMK. Women feature strongly. And within the Portuguese world, speaking world, at least Mozambique comes up. But in Angola, it wasn't well studied. And so this particular essay, which gave me the job, also came from that point of curiosity and also frustration and aggravation about how stories of women in Africa, how stories of women's agency in politics has been told, right? It's through two specific lenses, as we all know, mostly as victims of war, right? Or as this revered figure of Mother Africa, a woman carrying a rifle and a baby on her back, just a hustler down in the trenches in that sense, right? But there was no nuanced understanding of the actual experiences. I'm not saying that these particular tropes, the two tropes are wrong, but they don't give a full picture of women's participation in nationalist politics, at least in the period I'm looking at in the 60s through the 2000s. So I really wanted to sort of amplify, within the Portuguese world, also sort of give Angolan women voices and experiences and expose their participation in nationalist politics to the rest of the continent. And then also Meridian picked it up, and now I get all sorts of hits all over the place, and people are citing this particular articles. Okay, now people at least know the Angolan freedom struggles were not just about these two big men who were at each other's throats. Okay, three, but mostly the third one sort of fell off along the way. But the two big men, but women were there, right? This figure that we revere of an African woman carrying a baby and an AK-47, that image circulates a lot. It's what to sort of latch on to and think about romanticization of motherhood beyond childbearing, right? But so for me, I wanted to see that image, but then use it to sort of flip it around and say, okay, so if she was not carrying a rifle, how would she have been bred, right? Just through her mothering duties. And so here motherhood in this particular case sort of takes on a symbolic role and also a real role in terms of lived experiences of women. And so in thinking about patriarchy, where I made that claim, and I remember very clearly where I was when I wrote that specific sentence. Women experience patriarchal domination differently. I was at the airport in Lisbon from Angola, okay? And now on my way back to Kenya and then coming to the States. And I just sort of flashed back to my time in Kenya, just after my undergrad, teaching high school, and I was in a small village in Narok, which is the Maasai land region, where, of course, women are sort of known, women and girls are known through this specific lens of them being victims of female genital cutting, being victims of the very patriarchal masculinist Maasai culture. And I remember coming across girls who were really, really eager to learn, to just know how to read and write, right? And so these girls would come to school and sell milk to the teachers. And one of them looked at me and she was just surprised, why are you wearing trousers? Are you a man? And that was her question. I said, no, I'm not. So why are you wearing that? I said, why do you ask that? She said, I would like to wear one someday. And so I didn't think about it in a wow, that's a profound sentiment. It just struck me the way she said it so boldly. It's sort of, this is a young girl at the age of probably 14 at the time asking these questions. And then I go back to my village, and I come from, again, a very patriarchal, I'm Luya. And again, if you understand the politics of the content and how culturally different it is, my mother was a teacher. She's retired now, but she earned more money than my father, right? Who was a politician. But my father, the village reveres my father. But within that context of my own nuclear family, I witnessed patriarchy in a way that was so unique too, but I did not know how to react to it. And what struck me, I remember asking my mom, why do you put up with this? Whatever situation was going on at the time. And she said, so that you can survive, right? And it wasn't pretty stuff, but she was there. And then I go to Lisbon, and I'm sort of hanging out after the archives at a cafe, and these woman almost the age of my mom in her 60s, working away at a cafeteria, at her coffee shop, selling coffees. And I noticed a man at the corner seated also just sipping his coffee and then talking to the woman. Then I learned later on that actually he was the husband to the barista. And he was yelling at her. He was, trying to sort of rush her. And I finally asked, he's a customer. Why do you put up with him? He said, he's my husband. And I'm like, okay, so you own this? Yes. This is my coffee shop, but he's my husband. So at the airport, I'm seated there thinking about these 3 different scenarios of how patriarchal power is so powerful in this particular sense, but women, whether the young girl in Narok, in Kenya, or my mother, or the woman in Lisbon, sort of look at male power in a different way, but figure out how to actually survive it, or live within it, or negotiate it, despite what's going on in their lives. So I wrote that thinking that way. And for me, I think it's also very important in terms of my own work to think about patriarchy itself, and specifically the female body and representation. So when you're talking about politics of survival, when you're talking about agency, and I'm thinking about agency here through the words of Saba Mahmood's work, right, in The Politics of Piety, where you think about docile bodies, like pious women, for example, how do they enact their agency? And in the case of African politics, you think about African women as being apolitical, at least women in the rural areas, right? If you're not educated or a little man, you're sort of political. If you're not, but if you're just in the villages, doing your work, agricultural labor and all that, you've seen as apolitical. And I've always found this particular term a little bit unsettling to me, because as I argue in my book, like women's work is always project work, because by project I mean like they're not just thinking about food or feeding the family. When they think about that, what they're actually gesturing towards is about food systems and survival and climate change. What will happen if it's drought time, or if it's the rainy seasons and I lose all my crops? How is my family going to survive? And so from a very macro perspective, you think about it, it's not just about feeding the family, it's about things that shape policy. But when it comes to actually who are the headliners in those policy-making decisions, these women are not there. So that's why I get that term apolitical is really unsettling to me, because women's work is always political. And in the case of war, specifically in the case of Angolan women and war, again, we can think about all the vanguards of national liberation movements. All of them are men. And women, as the argument always goes, and think about, or at least in terms of the civil rights movement, remember, it reminds me of Charles Payne's work in terms of the histories of civil rights, when they say men led while women organized, right? And so in the African context, the argument has been, at least if you think about women's political mobilization representation, in terms of politics, from a patriarchal analysis, you'll say, okay, fine, women are always on the back burner, period. So what do we do to bring women into the conversation? We just put women in legislatures or national assemblies and then start the pot and move on. I'm not interested in that kind of politics. It's important. Representation matters. Having a number of women increased in any legislative elections is important, but there has to be more to that. What happens to the women who are not part of the electoral politics, stirring the pot, right? And so for me, then I'm like, okay, yes, men are the leaders of national liberation movements. We're not going to fight about that. It's true. They're doing important work. Women are on the back burner. So let's zoom out. Let's focus on that back burner. What kind of organization is going on in terms of labor organization, agricultural labor, mobilization, taking care of the children, feeding the nation, literally, right? A nation at war. And so that's where I think my work becomes very useful in this particular essence, in this particular chapter that I published, because what I was hoping to do is really amplify the voices of women who worked behind the scenes, specifically in the Angolan liberation movements. Behind the scene, I mean here, literally behind the scenes, right? And so sort of trying to cut through or pierce through this narrative of women as victims of war, as women just being helpers to the male leaders, and really going back to see what kind of labor were they doing. And so when I focus on that, I realized actually their labor was no less, powerful than the men's were. They may not have been carrying guns. Few of them were, but not all of them were carrying guns. Okay, most of them were really working in the agricultural fields, ensuring that the laborers, the soldiers are fed, worrying about their sons and husbands at war. If they don't have children, also like trying to get some education so that they can actually carry on the cultural work of educating a country that is going to, be independent. So those different roles, multiple roles that women play, sometimes contradictory, because again, the maternal body, if you focus on the maternal body from a feminist perspective, there's always that tension, right? There's that contradictory nature of maternalism within feminism, right? You amplify it, you sort of focusing on the women's birth canal as if there's something wrong with that. But then, I think there's something powerful about the female body, right? And whether women had children or not, in my case in Angola, and also myself when I was interviewing most Angolan women, the first question they would ask me, are you a mother? No. Are you married? No. So how can you see me? Right? And it wasn't like they didn't trust me because I didn't have children. They wanted me to recognize the role of motherhood. Okay, so one woman said, yes, you don't have children, you're not married, but don't you have a mother? I said, yes. Don't you have a grandmother? I said, yes. So you are a mother, right? So the maternal, my body at that age was being coded and read as already in mothering mode, right? And so once I sort of shifted my understanding of what a maternal body really means in relation to feminists, it was easier for me to sort of unlock these conversations with other women and tell me exactly what their roles were.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. And then our last speaker, by no means least, is Janell. So Janell, here are your questions. What led you to explore hip hop and popular music as an arena to address complex representations at the intersection of race and gender? How does the subject expand on issues of critical race and transnational feminism? And I see that you gave us some teasers on that, so we're excited to hear you flesh that out. And what was the inspiration, behind focusing a special issue on Harriet Tubman? How does she, as a historical figure, fit into our contemporary discussions about representations of the body?
All right, well, thank you. Actually, just think to the whole panel, because I'm just listening and absorbing and getting some interesting ideas. And I'm going to bring a few things up that Selina mentioned that I just thought about spur of the moment as it relates to Harriet Tubman. But to answer the first question, I actually started doing my critical analysis of hip hop when I was writing my first book, Venus in the Dark, which actually emerged out of my dissertation, which was looking at the history of the Hottentot Venus, Sarah Bartman, the South African Khoisan woman who was placed on exhibit. And I looked at the history, but also looking at remnants of that history in terms of what I thought were echoes that we could see throughout contemporary representations of Black womanhood across the board, whether we're talking about in the US, in the Caribbean, on the African continent, et cetera. And so hip hop became a really useful space, as well as some other arenas like dance hall and soca calypso in Trinidad. You see the use of the bati. I called it the bati politic, borrowing from Jamaican culture, and specifically the ways in which especially within dance and visualizations of Black women's dance, there's always the emphasis and the kind of fetishization of our bodies through our booties or batis, whatever. And so hip hop actually became a really good space to look at that because of the ways in which Black women's bodies were completely hyper visible in that setting. But of course, once you start looking at critiques and representation, you also look at the overall culture. And I realized that it was useful, at least with that first issue, to really delve into how Black women shaped that entire culture, whether we're talking about, the very first hip hop party that took place in Cedric Avenue in the South Bronx, and I used to live in Cedric Avenue. I was born in the Bronx, and I even remember going to high school in Brooklyn, and my classmates, I still see them whenever Public Enemies Fight the Power, that video, because I see they all showed up. That was a day I missed. But I was like, but at least I see you guys. But they came recruiting for us to be in that video, and it was shot and directed by Spike Lee. So we're talking about, growing up in the culture and wanting to really be part of it, but then at the same time having this uneasy relationship because of the way misogyny and misogynoir in particular really was also shaping that as well. And so hip hop had to be a space to critique, and I was really pleased to be able to start doing that. You had other scholars like Trisha Rose and Bell Hooks who were already doing that work, that cultural studies work, and others were able to build on it, such as like the Crunk Feminist Collective, for example, Moya Bailey terming misogynoir out of her critique of hip hop, and that happened back in 2010. Brittany Cooper doing that work as well. So that really was the kind of, springboard in which we can really talk about what's going on in terms of the sexual politics, and not just the sexual politics, but how it intersects with race. So, but because, in my first book, I'm delving in with both history and with present day, I also do critiques of historical representations as well. So Harriet Tubman just kind of came out of that discourse. And within hip hop music, everybody, just about every track references Harriet Tubman in one way or another, because that's what happens when you become a folk hero. And Harriet Tubman is definitely a folk hero, even though once you actually start delving into her specific history, you realize that there's only like this tiny little part of her life that we even know about, which is all about the Underground Railroad. We don't look at the work she did during the Civil War, even though that was probably her biggest triumph, in which she was able to liberate 750 people on one night on the Combahee River in South Carolina, for which the Combahee River Collective, commemorates that through their naming of that, right? And those become important spaces to recognize. And so I realized, both in terms of hip hop, you can have this very transnational flow of music and sampling and all of that, in terms of creating, not only just creating spaces, but even the way that our United States government will use hip hop to then influence, foreign policy, because it's so popular. And of course, in terms of Black subjects who are always doing that fine dance between being resistance and anti-colonialism and actually, perpetuating U.S. imperialism, it's always going back and forth. And hip hop absolutely represents that. And I remember the last time I was in Europe, Paris, actually. I mean, hip hop was all over the place. And I was just like, what? They're still breakdancing over here? Oh, wow. Okay. So we haven't done that since the 80s, but that's cool. Do you? Right? But yes, exactly. In those spaces, you see, how that is still out there, which is why it was also featured in the Parisian Summer Olympics, by the way. That's a whole other conversation. That's a whole other conversation. But Harriet Tubman also, she lives on in these very interesting ways in terms of representation. Whether we are talking about her transnational space. I had an interesting article in the special issue that talks about her time in Canada and whether or not we could see her existing beyond just a U.S. context. She herself, had these conversations with I think Pandita Rambai, an Indian reformist. She actually had correspondence with Queen Victoria. So there was a way in which she was already transnational, already global. And even in terms of Liberia, you were talking about wars, and I actually thought about that particular family of the Tubmans who thought they were related to Harriet Tubman, but not, well, you know, everyone will claim it, but really they were related to her husband that she left behind. But don't tell them that. But there's this transnational connection, and Ghana, you know, is willing to claim her because Harriet Tubman claims herself to be Ashanti. So there are ways in which everybody can claim her, and people still claim her, or even like on social media, you'll have people who, within Black communities, who'll say, well, don't be that kind of person she'll leave behind. Or maybe, yeah, or my favorite, don't be the kind that she'll have to shoot. And that, of course, is part of that militant image of Harriet Tubman. At the exhibit in Charleston at the Gibbs Museum, there were so many images of her with her gun, with her rifle. So there's something that's very powerful. So I was listening to Selina talking about how, you know, African women are represented or not having the guns, and Harriet Tubman's image, that is always emphasized, which is interesting. At the National Museum of African American History and Culture, she's not represented with her gun. She's actually represented with the lace shawl that Queen Victoria gifted her. So there's a more feminine image that we have of her at the museum. And actually, I also learned that they removed her gospel hymn. I don't know what that's about, unless it's the whole thing about how she used that music for coded language, right? It could be that, because she's too subversive to be in a Smithsonian. At least right now she is. And if she's too subversive for the Smithsonian, that means it's going to be a while before we see her on the $20 bill. So unfortunately, some people were divided about that too, in terms of whether or not that's appropriate, but I'm like, this is not about appropriate. She won. It was a popular vote. Everybody wanted Harriet Tubman over everybody else, because that's the popularity of her representation, right? So all of those are, I think, it's just a reminder of why representation matters. Really. And even in terms of folks who are like, we should really try to push on the currency. I'm like, no, stop. Let's not bring it up. Let them forget that that's supposed to be on the agenda, because the goal was for her to be on it in 2030. 2030, we'll have some reckoning to do. And maybe that will be part of our reckoning. I actually call it ancestral futurism, because that gives us a vision for where we can be. And we can be in the kind of America where Harriet Tubman is on our currency.
Thank you. Yes, we have how many minutes?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we can.
We can wrap up.
Okay.
8 minutes for Q&A. Yeah.
Yes.
Let's do it.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I'm just going to keep this short because I have so many questions, and you can pick whichever you want to answer. I mean, some of these articles have been published 10 years now.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about the contribution that the articles have made, both conceptual, theoretical, or methodological, what would you have updated since it got published? Because for me, a day after it's published, I'm like, oh my God, yeah, I could have done this, I could have done that, I could have. So for you, for each of you, whatever you would have done or not done since it got published. And the second one has to do with the notion of postcolonial as a temporal marker. Because when you think about Cote d'Ivoire, it's been 60 years from now. It's the postcolonial of 1965, the same as 2005. It's a post-colonial 1980, the same as 2005. And some of us have been saying those big categories, the pre-colonial, the post-colonial, and the colonial are sometimes inaccurate. They obscure so many details that are interesting that we could be exploring, but we really obscure all of those things. So what is the post-colonial? When would the post-colonial end? What would you end? When would you stop saying the post-colonial? The pre-colonial, we're covering thousands of years in African history, and we're still saying pre-colonial, really. Whichever you want to answer. Thank you so much.
Maybe we'll take, you want to do all the questions at once or one at a time?
Let's just see how the panelists want to take them. Thank you for your question, and you already said there were a lot, so we do our best in the time. If we can give like 2 minutes to that, so that we can have one or two.
We take all of
Yeah.
All the questions
Yeah,
from
let's
the
do
whole
that so
audience?
we can, yeah.
Can you, I couldn't hold that in my head. Can you? Sure. Oh, good.
Okay.
All right. They're bright people, so yeah.
You have a microphone?
Thank you, panel. My question is for Chandra. And I wanted to hear you talk about Black Europe studies as a field that is maybe evolving, and where you see Black feminist studies or critical feminist and gender studies within that, evolving partly for some of the reasons you were alluding to, a sense of inspiration, but also maybe a sense of something more particular about a Black experience as a European. And I wanted to hear you reflect a bit on that. And then the last question, I mean, I live on Sedgwick Avenue, actually, but I wanted to hear you talk about, because you alluded to, dealing with the Bati or the booty politics of hip hop. But I wanted to hear you expand on that. I mean, like, what do you, when you're talking about the role of Black women in elaborating the politics of AS, basically.
Okay.
We've heard a few women artists start to kind of theorize that themselves, and but maybe not in the earlier generation. And so I'm maybe like post Trisha Rose, post all that writing. And I wanted to hear you talk about, how do you think women hip hop artists are engaging with like feminist thought on the body?
Okay.
Any other questions? All right, I think we have a nice full body of
Also,
questions.
we have about 3 minutes
You have
left.
one?
So we're good. Are we good?
We'll go 5 minutes, Alex, but let's,
Yeah.
any other questions? No, that's it.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
Okay, so anyone can jump in. Give your 30 seconds and we keep going.
So let me just quickly respond to the question about the Bati, because that was really, I actually, when I wrote my article, The Bati Politic, it was really a critique of the ways in which whether or not we as Black women could control the narrative around what our bodies were doing. And the reason why I chose Bati versus Booty, right, was because of the ways in which I found Jamaican dancehall in particular to be very raw, very in your face, and one of the things I noticed, because I was in Jamaica as well, and one of the things I noticed is that they would move their bodies in a way that a man couldn't just come up on her. Right? And so there was a way in which they were controlling that space because they were deliberately being vulgar, right? Of course, Carolyn Cooper, one of the Jamaican scholars, she calls it the body, she calls it the body vulgar, but she's also looking at what she calls a fertility right. And she sees it as a kind of women being able to own their space. And that's a very different kind of body language versus the complete objectification that we see in commercial media, where men can easily go up to that body because they own that space. And specifically women who are playing to the gaze. Now, granted, the Jamaican dancehall, they're playing to the gaze too. But they're doing it in a way of, you try and touch this. You can't, right? And so I saw that there was this kind of power that was being embodied. And I thought about that too in terms of the dance we saw earlier during lunch and the ways in which women are able to just really use up space and use their legs, or even the shouting and the ululation that we hear, that those are ways in which you see how women can really just take over the space. And, it's the kind of thing where men will be too afraid to go up. To those, because they feel they can't control you. And so I saw resistance there. So that's kind of like where I was going with that.
Tanya Shirley has a great point about
I'll be really brief. I appreciate the point also about the post-colonial and thinking about these histories. And I think it's interesting because it's the way in which migration becomes translated in the Dutch context is one can never become Dutch, right? I mean, I'm half white, I'm half Dutch. I'm not read as Dutch, evidently, but I'm second generation, as in on my dad's side, migrant from South Africa, Durban, like Indian South African. But in the way that Moroccan, Turkish, Surinamese, there's no Dutchness, right? There's no arrival at Dutchness. So there's a query there that should be addressed without also overly relying on US, again, dominant frameworks, because now the language, the politics of translation also means that sometimes people are describing themselves in ways where we don't get the specificity, which relates to the point about Black Europe. I think I'm hesitant to kind of situate this project and my work as a Black European Studies project, precisely because the material experience of Blackness in Europe, I think, should be centered and acknowledged in a very specific way. And even though Black British feminists and this movement made use of political Blackness, which comes into the archives and materials and stories, which I account for, I'm not trying to reify this politic of political Blackness, right? But I am trying to find a space and a framework to acknowledge that these women, Black migrants as well as non-Black migrants, so as I said, from Turkey, Morocco, Indonesia, the Moluccans, they were working together. They were movement building for over a decade. So I'm trying to situate that under a different kind of framework, while obviously also in dialogue with Black European studies. And the final point I'll make on that is that I'm glad to see how the capaciousness of Black European studies, at least in a Dutch context, for instance, is broadening in the way that people like Gloria Becker, who have always done Black European studies, are now folded into this field as well, which has not been the case, right? And so I'm interested in, again, it's like the searching of the frameworks in dialogue, not to exclusion, but to be specific and to be respectful, but also to kind of find different ways in which we can think through difference and solidarity.
Thank you. Any thoughts from any other presenters? Okay, we're out of time. And on. And
again, I'll ask before you approach, we're going to take a photograph of our panel.